The storm had been building since noon. By the time it finally broke over the high country, it came down not like weather, but like punishment. Sideways sleet that cut through wool coats and turned the narrow wagon roads into rivers of brown slush. The horses hated it. The cattle hated it. Every man and woman trying to work the land that week hated it in the particular exhausted way that frontier people reserved for things they couldn't fight and couldn't outrun. You just dropped your head and moved through it, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying, and dying out here meant your bones stayed undiscovered until the spring thaw made them somebody else's problem. Rhett Mercer was heading back from Caldwell, the nearest town worth the name, with a wagon bed full of fencing supplies and a mood that matched the sky. He was 43 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite that pushed up through the Iron Hollow Ridge. His hair had gone the color of a winter creek, dark streaks through gray, and his hands were the kind of hands that told a life story without words. Knuckles scarred, fingers thick, palms crossed with old rope burns and older regrets. He'd buried his wife, Clara, 2 years prior. Fever took her in a week, which was both merciful and brutal in the way frontier deaths usually were. No slow decline, no time to prepare. Just a woman alive on Monday and gone by Sunday, leaving behind a husband who didn't know what to do with quiet, and a ranch that needed running regardless of whether its owner had any particular desire to keep running it. He kept running it anyway, not out of love for the land, though the love was there, buried under the practical weight of daily labor. He kept running it because stopping was the same as dying, and he wasn't quite ready for that yet. He told himself that most mornings when the alarm wasn't needed because the cold woke him up before it could ring. The Black Hollow station was a sorry excuse for a railroad stop. One wooden platform, one small structure that might charitably be called a waiting room if you were feeling generous and the wind wasn't blowing through the gaps in its walls. The train came through twice a week on its way further west, and it deposited passengers and freight with equal indifference before chugging onward into whatever misery lay beyond the ridge. Rhett slowed his horses when he saw her. She was sitting on the far end of the platform, which was technically outside the small overhang that might have given her some protection from the sleet. Whether she'd chosen the exposed position deliberately or simply hadn't thought about it, he couldn't tell. She was wearing a coat that was wrong for the weather, thin wool, cut for autumn at best, and her hair had gone dark and heavy with ice melt against her neck. Her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that looked less like patience and more like the body shutting down. He pulled the wagon to a stop and sat there for a moment, watching. She didn't look up. That bothered him. Most people, when a wagon came rattling up on a desolate platform in a storm, at least turned their head. Curiosity was a survival instinct. The fact that she didn't look up suggested one of two things. She was too far gone to care, or she'd been sitting there long enough that her expectations about rescue had already died, and she hadn't gotten around to revising them. He climbed down from the wagon. His boots hit the platform boards with a sound like a hammer strike, and even that didn't make her flinch. Up close, she was younger than he'd initially thought. Mid-20s, maybe? Hard to say. The cold had done something to her face, not just the redness, but a flatness in the features that came from sustained stress and no sleep. Her eyes, when she finally raised them to look at him, were a particular shade of gray that he'd later describe as the color of a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or snow and had settled on doing both badly. "Ma'am," he said. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they've given up expecting. "Train left?" he said. "Hours ago." Her voice was rough at the edges, like something that had been used too hard and then left out in the cold. "I wasn't on it." "Waiting for the next one?" A long pause. "No." He looked at her hands again. The fingertips had gone a color that concerned him. "You need to come with me," he said. Not a request, exactly, more like a statement of geography. This is where we are. This is what happens next. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her running some internal calculation. Probably the same calculation any woman alone in the territory would run when a strange man showed up and made an offer. He was aware of how he looked, large, weathered, face that even on its best days didn't invite trust. He didn't know how to make himself look less threatening, and he didn't particularly try, because pretending to be something he wasn't had never worked for him, and he'd mostly stopped attempting it. "I don't have any money," she said. "I didn't ask for any." "I don't..." She stopped. Something moved across her face that he couldn't read. I don't know you. Rhett Mercer. I ranch about 4 miles up the ridge. He waited. You got a name? Another pause, shorter this time. Elena. Elena Voss. Well, Elena Voss, your fingers are going to fall off if you stay out here, and I'd rather not have that on my conscience this week. It's already a full conscience. He held out his hand, not to shake, just to help her up. Come on. She stared at his hand for a long moment. Then she took it. Her grip was weak, which worried him more than anything else had. A person with any strength left in them grabbed with some intention, even when they were scared. Her hand just settled into his like it didn't have the energy for intention. He helped her to the wagon and didn't comment on the way she moved, careful, slightly stiff, like she was managing something she didn't want him to see. He got her up onto the bench, went around, climbed up himself, and clicked the horses forward without making any more conversation than necessary. She didn't make any either. They rode in silence for about a mile before he reached behind the bench and pulled out the heavy wool blanket he kept back there for weather emergencies. He handed it to her without looking. She took it without thanks, which he didn't hold against her. Thanks implied you had something left over for social niceties, and she clearly didn't. The road up to Iron Hollow Ridge wound through stands of pine that gave some shelter from the sleet. And by the time the ranch house came into view, the worst of the storm had moved east and left behind only a sullen gray sky and an inch of new sleet on the ground. The house was a solid structure. Nothing beautiful, nothing that would attract admiring looks from people who cared about beauty. But it was well built and maintained with a deep porch and windows that didn't rattle. Rhett had spent the better part of a decade making sure everything that could fail had been reinforced until failure became inconvenient rather than catastrophic. He stopped the wagon by the porch and jumped down. Come on inside, he said. There's a fire. She climbed down herself, refusing the hand he offered this time, which he took as a good sign. The independence was coming back. Inside the house, the fire was doing its job. Rhett had built it up before leaving that morning because the cold had teeth, and he hated coming home to a cold house. It was one of the small stubbornnesses that had survived his wife's death. Clara had always kept the house warm, and he'd inherited the habit rather than let it go with her. He gestured toward the chair closest to the hearth. Sit. She sat, pulled the blanket tighter, watched him move around the kitchen with eyes that tracked everything, the layout, the exits, the positions of things that could be used as weapons. He noticed her doing it and said nothing. It was the watching of someone who'd learned that knowing your surroundings wasn't paranoia, it was arithmetic. He put water on for coffee and found the last of the biscuits he'd made 2 days ago. They'd gone a bit stiff, but they'd soften over heat, and they were better than nothing. You eaten today? He asked. This morning. A pause. Yesterday morning. He put more biscuits on. You want to tell me what you were doing at Black Hollow Station? She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. He didn't push. He'd learned, somewhere in the years of working with people and animals in difficult circumstances, that pushing usually produced less than waiting. I got off the train, she finally said. The one from the east. I was supposed to keep going west, but... She stopped. I couldn't. Couldn't what? Couldn't keep going. Not yet. Her hands tightened on the blanket. I didn't have a plan when I got off. I just needed to stop moving. He poured the coffee when it was ready and handed her a cup. She wrapped both hands around it, and the expression on her face when the warmth hit her palms was the most human thing he'd seen from her yet, eyes closing briefly, something in the shoulders releasing. Where are you headed? He asked. Eventually. I don't know anymore. Where are you from? This pause was the longest yet. He could hear the fire working. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the pines with a sound like breathing. A ranch, she said, about 200 miles east of here. The Voss Spread, my family called it. It's not called anything anymore. She looked at her coffee. There's nothing left to name. He sat down in the chair across from her. Not close, giving her space, which was instinct from years of working with spooked horses. You didn't crowd something that was already braced for the worst. What happened? He asked. She looked up at him. Something in her face shifted. Not softening, exactly. More like she was deciding how much was safe to say to a stranger and measuring the risk against the exhaustion of carrying it alone. Men came, she said. The Graves Syndicate. You know that name? He did. Anyone working land in the territory knew that name the way you knew the name of a storm system that kept coming back. The Graves Syndicate had been operating in the eastern reaches for at least a decade, a network of land brokers, hired guns, and bought officials who specialized in acquiring ranches through a combination of legal pressure and illegal violence. They were patient and they were thorough, and the ranches they wanted had a tendency to end up available one way or another. I know it, he said. They came to my father 6 months ago, said they wanted to buy the land. He said no. Her voice was very flat now. They came back, said they'd made a better offer and he should reconsider. She paused. He still said no. And then? And then they stopped asking. She set the coffee cup down carefully, like she was afraid her hands might not be steady enough to hold it. They came at night, 3 weeks ago. 4 of them, maybe more. I was in the back of the house. I heard my father in the front room, and then I heard... She stopped, started again. I heard what gunshots sound like when they're not meant as a warning. Rhett didn't say anything. I ran, she said. I know how that sounds. I ran out the back while they were still in the front room, and I ran into the dark and I kept running until I found a road, and then I found a wagon going to the rail station, and I just... She pressed her lips together. I ran. I left him there. You survived, Rhett said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him with some surprise as if she'd expected him to offer comfort she clearly wouldn't have believed. He didn't deal in comfort. He couldn't back up with facts. What he'd said was accurate. Surviving and not abandoning were 2 different things, and pretending otherwise would have been condescending. You can stay here, he said, while you figure out what comes next. I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to. He stood up. There's a room at the back of the house. It was a guest room. It's cold right now, but it'll warm up. You sleep tonight, eat tomorrow, and then we'll see where things stand. She watched him for a moment. Why? Why what? Why would you do that? For someone you don't know? He thought about it. He could have given her a simple answer. Said it was because it was right, or because anyone would, or some other shorthand that would have closed the conversation efficiently. Instead, he said the actual truth, because he was too tired for anything else. My wife used to say this land either breaks people or it builds them, he said. She believed pretty strongly that helping the ones it was trying to break was the only decent response. I've spent 2 years disagreeing with her about a lot of things since she died, but not that one. Elena Voss looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once and picked up her coffee again. The first 3 days she slept more than she was awake. He noticed this because it was hard not to notice. She'd appear at meals, eat with the focused efficiency of someone refueling rather than tasting, exchange minimal words, and then disappear again. He didn't take it personally. He recognized the behavior from the period after Clara died, when his own body had demanded unconsciousness as a way of processing what the waking mind couldn't handle. He left her alone. He had a ranch to run. Iron Hollow Ridge wasn't large by the standards of the old cattle barons. 240 acres of mixed grass and pine forest running up against the ridge proper, with a creek that stayed reliable most of the year and a south-facing slope that gave the grazing land enough warmth to hold cattle through most winters. He ran about 90 head currently, down from 130 because the autumn had been brutal and the market prices had made culling painful but necessary. He had one permanent hand, a quiet Mexican man named Augusto, who'd been working the ridge for 7 years and had opinions about exactly 3 things: horse breeding, the proper way to fix fence, and the optimal time to start the morning coffee. On everything else, he maintained a diplomatic silence that Rhett had come to deeply appreciate. Augusto took one look at Elena at breakfast on the second morning and said nothing beyond a polite nod. He asked Rhett about it later, briefly. Who is she? Someone who needed a place. Augusto considered this. She's trouble? Not the kind that's her fault. Augusto nodded slowly. The other kind is always worse, he said, and went back to his coffee, and that was the extent of the conversation. On the 4th day, Elena came out of the house while Rhett was working with a young mare who'd developed a bad habit of cow kicking when you reached for her left rear foot. It was the kind of problem that required patience and time and a willingness to absorb a few hits in the interest of eventual trust. Rhett had been at it for an hour and was making slow progress. He heard the porch creak and looked over. Elena was standing at the rail, watching. She had more color in her face than she'd had at the station, and her eyes were doing their tracking thing again, but with something else now. Something that looked less like vigilance and more like interest. "What's wrong with her?" Elena asked. "Doesn't like her back left foot touched? Previous owner was rough with her, I think. She associates the reach with something bad." "You're going slow. Only way it works." She watched for a while. The mare shifted, laid her ears back, but didn't kick. Rhett kept his movements easy and predictable, which was the whole trick. Not sneaking up on the foot, but approaching it so openly and consistently that it stopped being surprising. "Can I try?" Elena asked. He looked at her. "You ride?" "I grew up on a ranch." Something slightly sharp in the words, not directed at him, just there. "Right." He stepped back from the mare, who settled when he moved away. "Her name's Dusk. She's 3 years old and she's smart, which means she learns fast in both directions." Elena came off the porch and walked to the fence with the measured approach of someone who'd grown up around horses and had the sense not to charge at them. She climbed through the rails and stood at a distance that was respectful without being fearful, and waited. The mare looked at her. Elena didn't move, just stood there, hands at her sides, not making a big deal of her presence, and waited for the horse to decide. It took about 2 minutes. The mare extended her nose, pulling air, reading her. Elena stayed still. Then the mare walked toward her, slowly, stopping about a foot away, and Elena raised one hand and let Dusk smell it before touching her neck. "Hey," Elena said quietly. "I know, people are hard to trust." Rhett watched this and said nothing. She worked with Dusk for 20 minutes. Just the neck and shoulder and back. Nothing near the problematic foot. Just getting the mare used to her specifically. Then she stepped back and looked at Rhett. "Tomorrow I'll try the foot," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She pushed a strand of hair back from her face. "I want to do something. I can't just sleep and eat your food and—" She stopped. "I need something to do." He understood that. Grief and trauma needed occupation the way a fire needed fuel. Without it, they turned inward and burned the thing they were supposed to warm. "All right," he said. "Morning feeding starts at 6. Augusto will show you the routine." She nodded and walked back toward the house. At the porch, she stopped without turning around. "Mr. Mercer." "Rhett." A brief pause. "Rhett. Thank you." "Get some sleep," he said. 6 comes early. Deb. She was up before 6. Augusto found her in the barn when he arrived, already moving through the stall routine with the focused competence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching, and then he said, "You forgot to check the left catch on the 3rd stall. It slips." She went back and fixed it without comment. He handed her the feed scoop, and they worked in silence for 40 minutes, and at the end of it he said, "You know horses," and she said, "I know most things that matter on a ranch," and he nodded and said, "Good." And that was apparently the end of Augusto's evaluation. The days built into a rhythm. It happened gradually, the way most things that matter happen. Not with any announcement or decision, just the accumulation of shared work and proximity until a pattern was established, and breaking it would have felt strange. Elena worked. She worked with a focus that Rhett recognized as the coping mechanism it was, pouring the excess energy of grief and anger into labor, because standing still meant feeling things she wasn't ready to feel. He didn't call her on it because he'd done the same thing for 2 years, and he wasn't in a position to judge the coping strategies of people who were earlier in the process than he was. But he watched. He watched her with Dusk, who came around faster than expected, surrendering the left foot to Elena's handling by the 2nd week with a patience that the horse definitely had not shown him. He watched her with the cattle, which she handled with a quiet authority that suggested she'd spent genuine time in a working herd rather than just observing one. He watched her in the evenings when she sat by the fire with her hands in her lap and her eyes somewhere else entirely, and he watched the way she came back from wherever she went, pulling herself into the present with a visible effort, like someone climbing up out of deep water. She didn't cry, not once that he saw. He wasn't sure if that was strength or a wound that hadn't found its exit yet. 3 weeks in, she found the rifles. He'd left the gun cabinet unlocked. Careless, his wife would have said. Though Clara had never really worried about guns the way some people did, had grown up with them and understood them as tools. And he came into the front room to find Elena standing in front of the open cabinet, looking at the rifles the way you might look at something you weren't sure how to feel about. "Sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. I wasn't going to take anything." "I know," he said. "You shoot?" She looked at him. "Yes." "How well?" "Well enough." Something behind her eyes. "My father taught me." He pulled the Winchester from the cabinet. Not the best rifle he owned, but a reliable one, accurate at reasonable distances, forgiving of the kind of minor form errors that showed up when someone was rusty. "Come on." "Where?" "The back fence line. Nothing out there but rocks and distance." They set up tin cans on the fence post about 40 yards out, which was the kind of distance that sorted the people who said they could shoot from the people who actually could. Elena picked up the rifle with the ease of familiarity, checked the chamber, checked the sight, took her position. She stood for a moment just breathing, and then she brought the rifle up and fired. The can flew. She fired again, and again. 5 for 5 before she lowered the rifle and worked the action to clear it. 40 yards, Rhett said. "I used to go out to 70 with my father's rifle," she said. 80 on a good day. "That was his rifle. What about with one you don't know?" She looked at him. Then she raised the Winchester again and fired at a rock twice as far out and missed by about 8 inches left. "Pull," he said. "I know." She adjusted her grip, fired again. This time it was 4 inches right. She made a face. "You're squeezing the trigger instead of pressing it," he said. "You're anticipating the recoil." "I know what I'm doing wrong." "I know you do. I'm just saying it out loud so we can both acknowledge you know." She almost smiled. Almost. "You're condescending when you try to be helpful." My wife said the same thing. He picked up his own rifle. "I never figured out how to fix it." He set up more cans. They worked for another hour until the light started going and the cold came back in full and the ammunition was running low. By the end, she was hitting consistently at 60 yards with the Winchester, and he'd stopped offering corrections because she didn't need them. Walking back to the house, she said, "I want to learn to shoot better." "You already shoot well." "I want to shoot better than well." He looked at her. "You have something in mind?" She didn't answer right away. The ridge was going gold and purple above them in the last light, the kind of evening sky that made even bleak country look almost forgiving. "The Graves Syndicate," she said finally. "They didn't stop with my father's land. I know that because I've been listening. People at the station, travelers. They're still moving west, still taking ranches, still—" She stopped. "They're still doing what they did." "Elena, I know." She said it sharply, preemptively. "I know what you're going to say." "Then I'll save us both the time," he said. "What are you planning?" She walked for a while before answering. A crow called somewhere in the pines and then went quiet. "I don't have a plan," she said. "Not yet. I just know that what they did doesn't stop happening until someone makes it stop." She looked at him sidelong. "You know that's true." He did know. That was the problem with living in the territory. You saw enough of what happened to people who had no one standing between them and the organized violence of men like the Graves Syndicate, and you understood that the official structures meant to prevent those things were either too far away or too well paid to care. Justice in the territory was a local product, often handmade, rarely pretty. "That kind of thing gets people killed," he said. "They already killed my father." Her voice didn't break, it just went very flat and very still. "I don't have a lot left to lose." He stopped walking. She stopped a few steps later and turned to look at him. "You have your life," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do." She looked at him steadily. "And I'd like to do something with it that means something, instead of running until I fall off the edge of the map." He looked at her for a long moment. The last light was going fast now, the ridge going dark against the sky. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll go further out. I'll set up a longer range." She held his gaze. "That's not a no. It's not a yes either." He started walking again. "It's tomorrow." But the territory had its own timeline, and it didn't wait on personal reckonings. The first sign of trouble came in the second month. A man came through, rode up to the ranch on a sorrel horse that had been ridden hard and not well rested, with the look of someone conducting a survey. He said his name was Bales, said he was with a land assessment company out of the east, said he was riding the territory and gathering information on independent ranch operations. Rhett met him at the gate. He didn't open the gate. "What kind of information?" Rhett asked. "Standard assessment." Bales had a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Water rights, acreage, head count, nothing unusual." "Who contracted you?" "Private party, land investors." "Name?" A small pause. "Multiple parties." "A consortium." Rhett looked at him for a long moment. The man was well-dressed in the particular way of someone who wanted to look prosperous but had made slightly wrong choices about which details conveyed prosperity. His horse had a brand that Rhett didn't recognize. "I'm not interested in assessment," Rhett said, "and I'm not interested in investors." "Your land is quite isolated," Bales said. He said it in a tone that was meant to sound observational but landed somewhere near to a reminder. "Must be challenging to manage alone." "I manage fine." "Still," Bales looked past Rhett toward the ridge. "Running a remote operation like this, if something were to go wrong, help would be a long way off." "That's true for most people in this territory," Rhett said. "We're used to relying on ourselves." The man's smile held a beat too long. "Of course. Well," he reached into his coat and produced a card. "If you change your mind about the assessment or about selling, my employer is prepared to make a very reasonable offer." Rhett didn't take the card. Bales held it a moment, then tucked it back into his pocket. "Have a good day, Mr. Mercer." He rode off without hurrying, which was somehow worse than if he'd left quickly. Rhett watched him go until he was around the first bend in the road, then walked back to the house. Elena was on the porch. She'd been there the whole time. "You recognized him," Rhett said. "No." She was watching the empty road. "But I recognized the type." She looked at Rhett. "How long has the Graves Syndicate been in this part of the territory?" "Not as long as further east." He came up the porch steps. "But they're moving." "He was cataloging your defenses," she said. "How far you are from help. How many people. That's what those surveys actually are." "I know." She looked at him. "This isn't just about my family's land anymore." "No," he said. "It probably isn't." She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. The wind moved through the pines. A hawk made a wide circle over the far pasture, looking for something in the winter-pale grass. "Then we should start being serious about the range work," she said. He thought about what serious meant, about what it would cost in every currency he could think of if she was right about where this was heading, about the way the territory swallowed people whole when they stepped in front of forces larger than themselves and spat out their bones in the spring. He also thought about what Bales had said. Help would be a long way off. It wasn't meant as information. It was meant as a promise. "Tomorrow," he said again, and this time it meant something different than it had the day before. It does. Winter deepened. The snow came in earnest. Elena learned to shoot with the heavier rifle. She learned to track, not the way a hunter tracks, but the way a person tracks who needs to know when they're being watched. She learned the fence lines of Iron Hollow Ridge the way you learn the layout of a house you might need to evacuate in the dark. Systematic, practical, without drama. She also learned Rhett Mercer. Not completely. He wasn't a person who opened up like a book left in the sun. But she learned him in pieces, the way you learn anything that's been weathered into layers. She learned that he woke earlier than he let on, and that the first hour of his morning was private, spent with coffee on the porch regardless of temperature, looking at the ridge. She learned that he was harder on himself than on anyone else, and that this was both a strength and a source of the particular grimness that lived in the back of his eyes. She learned that he'd loved his wife with the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. She saw it in the small, maintained habits, the kept warmth of the house, the way he occasionally stopped mid-sentence as if he'd started a sentence she was supposed to finish and then remembered. She told him more about her father. Not all at once, in pieces, the way he gave her himself. Theodore Voss had been a hard man in the way that good frontier fathers were often hard. Demanding, uncomfortable with sentiment, better with horses than with words, but present, always present. He'd built the Voss Ranch from $300 in borrowed tools and the particular species of stubbornness that doesn't know it's remarkable because it's too busy working. He used to say the land doesn't care how you feel about it, she told Rhett one evening, the fire low, the wind working outside. It just responds to what you do with it. Smart man, Rhett said. He was. She looked at her hands. He should have known when to bend. That's the one thing he got wrong. She paused. He thought principle was the same thing as stubbornness. He thought standing firm was always the right answer. Against the Graves Syndicate, it was. It got him killed. The Graves Syndicate got him killed, Rhett said. Don't move that weight onto him. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. You're better at this than you think you are, she said. At what? At saying the right thing. He made a sound that might have been disagreement. My wife would have a long list of evidence against that. She'd also have a long list of evidence for it. She looked at the fire. Or she wouldn't have stayed. He didn't answer that, but something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly, and she counted it as the conversation landing. So, the mare, Dusk, gave them the first real warning. It was early morning, still dark enough that the stars were visible between cloud breaks, and Elena was in the barn doing the pre-dawn feeding that she'd taken over entirely by now. Dusk was in the far stall. She'd been moved there because she'd been bullying one of the older mares, and when Elena came through with the feed, Dusk was at the back of the stall, ears pinned hard, facing the rear wall. Horses didn't face walls for no reason. Elena set down the feed bucket very quietly. She moved to the barn door and looked out into the pre-dawn dark, and after 30 seconds of careful looking, she saw what Dusk had already heard. A figure at the far edge of the property, just standing there in the gap between two fence lines, watching the house. She went to the house. She woke Rhett with a hand on his shoulder and one word, someone. He was up and dressed in 4 minutes, which was faster than she'd have thought possible. He came out with the rifle and they went to the barn together, moving low. But when they got back to the gap in the fence, whoever had been there was gone. Just boot prints in the thin snow, facing the house. Watching, Rhett said quietly. Since at least 3 a.m, Elena said. That's when Dusk went weird. He crouched and looked at the boot prints. 2 men, maybe 3. He stood up. They're getting ready to move. We're taking inventory before someone decides whether it's worth it. He looked at her. It's worth it, he said. To them. Iron Hollow's got water rights the syndicate has been trying to get around for 2 years. Clara and I fought a legal battle over it. His jaw tightened. We won. They don't forget. So this isn't just about me being here. No. He looked at the ridge. This was coming regardless. You being here just... He paused. Just makes it feel like a war on 2 fronts at once. She stood beside him and looked at the ridge too. The sky was going slightly gray at the eastern edge, the first reluctant suggestion of morning. Good, she said. He looked at her. If it's a war, she said, I'd rather fight on the front that I know than the one I don't. He looked at her for a long moment. The gray light caught the angles of her face, and he thought, not for the first time, that she'd been put through something that would have destroyed a lot of people, and it hadn't destroyed her. It had done something else, something he didn't have a clean word for. Come inside, he said. We need to talk about the fence lines. The talking turned into planning, and the planning turned into work, and the work became the rhythm of the coming weeks. Elena rode the perimeter every morning and every evening, not just watching, but noting. Changes in the ground, the way the cattle behaved at the far fence, the angles from the ridge that would give an observer a sightline into the main yard. She'd learned something in those weeks of careful study that she hadn't had a clean vocabulary for before. She was learning to read the land as a tactical document, not just as terrain, but as possibility, both threat and defense. Rhett watched her do it and said little because she was learning faster than instruction could keep up with. And he'd always believed the most useful thing you could do for someone in that position was stay out of their way. But he watched. He watched because he couldn't quite stop. And because somewhere in the watching, he'd started to notice things that had nothing to do with horses or rifles or boot prints in the snow. The way she laughed, rare enough to mean something, sudden and genuine. Usually it's something Augusto said because Augusto had a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly and rewarded attention. The way she'd started to sit slightly less like a person ready to run, slightly more like a person with somewhere to be. The way the gray in her eyes had developed variation, not just the flat watchfulness of the first weeks, but depth. He didn't examine these observations too carefully. He was 43 years old, and he knew himself well enough to know where that particular examination led, and he wasn't ready for it, and he wasn't sure she was. And the ranch was heading for a confrontation that required his full attention, and the romantic considerations of a widowed rancher were about the furthest thing from relevant he could imagine. But he watched. And some evenings by the fire, when the wind was working outside and the house was warm and she was reading or working something over in her head, and the quiet between them had become the comfortable kind rather than the heavy kind. Some evenings he thought that his wife, who had opinions about everything and had spent their entire marriage pointing out what he was too stubborn to see on his own, would have had quite a lot to say about this situation. He thought Claire would probably have been right. He usually thought she would have been right. It was one of the lasting achievements of her life. The threat made itself formal on a Tuesday. A man came to the gate. Not Bales this time, someone else, harder looking, less interested in being politely menacing and more interested in being direct. He identified himself as coming on behalf of a business concern and handed Rhett an envelope without ceremony. Inside was an offer, printed on official-looking paper, a price for Iron Hollow Ridge that was low enough to be insulting while being high enough to pretend it was reasonable. Rhett read it. Elena read it over his shoulder. "They gave a deadline," she said. 10 days. "Yes." "What happens after 10 days? He folded the letter and looked at the man at the gate, who was watching him with the particular blankness of someone paid to deliver messages and not answer for their contents. "Tell your employer," Rhett said, "that Iron Hollow is not for sale." The man nodded, didn't look surprised, rode off. Rhett and Elena stood at the gate in the cold and watched him go. "They'll send someone back," she said. "Yes." "When?" "Before the 10 days are up." He tucked the letter into his coat. "They always come before the deadline. The deadline is for the paperwork. The pressure comes earlier." She was quiet. Then, "We should tell Augusto." "Yes. And we should check the back fence on the north side. That's the approach I'd use if I were coming in quietly." "I know." He looked at her. "I was thinking the same." She met his eyes. Something passed between them that wasn't words, the particular kind of understanding that comes from having worked alongside someone through enough difficulty that you stop needing to narrate the obvious. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." They turned and walked back up the road toward the house, and above them the ridge stood in the winter light, and the snow on the high slopes was still clean, and there was a quiet over Iron Hollow that felt, just then, like the quiet before something that had been building for a long time finally arrived. Elena walked with her head up and her hands steady. She had stopped running. The 10 days came and went without incident, which was worse than if something had happened. Rhett knew this from experience. Men like the ones behind the Graves Syndicate didn't miss deadlines by accident. When the deadline passed and no one came, it wasn't because they'd changed their minds. It was because they were making a different kind of point, that the timeline was theirs to set and reset, that the waiting itself was a tool, that Iron Hollow Ridge could sit and wonder and lose sleep, and eventually the uncertainty would do more work than any hired gun could. It was a smart strategy. He hated that it was working, at least partially, on him. He didn't sleep well through most of February. He told himself it was the cold and the wind and the general unpleasantness of frontier winters. And he was not a man who examined his own anxieties too carefully, because he found that examining them didn't reduce them, just gave them more conversational surface area. So he got up early and worked and watched the ridge and kept his rifle clean and made sure the horses were fed and did all the things that kept a ranch running, and he let the waiting do what it was going to do. Elena slept fine. This surprised him until it didn't. She'd already been through the worst of what waiting felt like. The weeks after her father's death, when she hadn't known what was coming or when every sound outside had been a potential return of the men who'd burned her world down. She'd lived in that particular terror and come out the other side of it, and whatever the Graves Syndicate sent their way now, it was coming toward someone who had already metabolized fear into something else, something harder and quieter and considerably more dangerous. She was up before 6 every morning regardless. Fed the horses, rode the perimeter, came back in for breakfast with the particular focused calm of someone who had decided what they were doing and had stopped using energy on second-guessing it. Augusto, who had by now fully absorbed the situation without being told most of it, had taken to riding the north fence line in the afternoons on his own initiative. He hadn't asked Rhett for permission or instruction. He just started doing it, the way Augusto handled most things, quietly, practically, without ceremony. "You don't have to do that," Rhett told him one afternoon when they crossed paths at the north gate. "I know," Augusto said. "This isn't your fight." Augusto looked at him with the expression of a man who found the statement mildly insulting. "I've worked this land 7 years," he said. "Where does that put me?" Rhett didn't have a good answer for that. Augusto went back to checking fence posts and the conversation was over. What changed things was the town. Caldwell sat about 8 miles from Iron Hollow by the main road, 12 if you went the long way around the ridge, which the stagecoaches preferred because it was easier on horses even if it was longer on time. It was the kind of town that existed because the railroad had decided it should, a collection of practical structures around a main street that had a general store, a land office, a saloon that also served as a de facto courtroom when the circuit judge came through, and enough people to make a post office economically defensible. Rhett went to Caldwell on supply runs roughly twice a month. He'd started taking Elena on the second run of February, partly because she needed to be seen in the territory, a visible presence that was harder to move against than an invisible one, and partly because she needed to learn the social landscape the way she'd learned the physical one. The social landscape was not welcoming. It started with looks. He'd expected looks. A strange woman at Iron Hollow Ridge, no clear story attached to her, showing up in the dead of winter. Frontier towns moved information faster than telegraph wires, and the information they moved was rarely improved by the journey. By the time the town had processed Elena's presence, the story had acquired several additions that had no relationship to reality. She was a runaway wife from back east. She was a woman of questionable profession seeking legitimacy. She was a fugitive of some unspecified kind. She was Rhett Mercer's mistress. She was Rhett Mercer's daughter by a previous marriage. She was someone he'd bought off a train like you'd buy a horse. None of this was said to either of their faces directly. It was present in the way women in the dry goods store found reasons to conclude their transactions before Elena reached the counter. In the way the conversations in the general store dropped to a register just below audible when they came through the door. In the way the storekeeper, Aldous Penn, who dealt with Rhett for years without anything but professional civility, suddenly found it necessary to explain policy about credit and accounting in excessive detail, as though Rhett's character had become suspect by association. Elena absorbed all of this without comment. On the ride back, Rhett watched her from the corner of his eye, waiting for the reaction he wasn't going to prompt, but was prepared to respond to. "You don't have to take me," she said eventually, "if it's causing you problems." "It's not causing me problems. The way Penn looked at you—" "Penn's a coward who reads the wind," Rhett said. "If the wind changes, he'll read differently." He kept his eyes on the road. "The wind is going to change." She was quiet for a moment. "You're very certain of that?" "No," he said. "I'm very determined about it. That's different." She looked at him sideways and something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the shape that a smile would leave if it had been there, and then moved on. They went to Caldwell again 2 weeks later, and the week after that. Rhett made it deliberate, not aggressive, not confrontational, just consistent. "Here we are. This is where we belong." The consistency was its own argument. It was on the 4th trip that things went sideways in a way that couldn't be ignored. A man named Cullen Vard had been drinking in the saloon since before noon, which was not unusual for Cullen Vard, who was the kind of man the frontier produced in low quantities but reliable regularity, grievance-filled, physically large, with a mouth that got ahead of his judgment when alcohol was involved. He was also, Rhett had known for some time, on the loose payroll of a land broker out of the East, whose name he'd heard connected to the Graves Syndicate through 2 intermediaries. Whether Vard knew who was actually paying him was an open question. Vard came out of the saloon while Elena was loading supplies into the wagon, and Rhett was settling the bill inside. He came out, and he stopped, and he looked at her with the particular look of a man who'd decided something before he opened his mouth. "You're the woman from the Mercer place," he said. Elena didn't stop loading. Yes. People are talking about you. I know. She lifted a sack of flour. People talk. They say you killed a man. She stopped then, but not from fear. She set the flour in the wagon and turned to face him with the unhurried attention of someone choosing to engage rather than unable to avoid it. Where did you hear that? She said. Around. Vard was swaying slightly, which made his size less intimidating than it might otherwise have been. They say you're trouble, that you brought something to this territory that was better left wherever you came from. That's a lot of conclusions for someone working on secondhand information, Elena said. It's called common sense. His voice had gotten louder, which brought the attention of the two men on the saloon porch and a woman outside the dry goods store who was pretending to examine her shopping while watching with avid interest. Women like you, women like me, Elena said, and her voice had gone very level, the kind of level that meant the temperature had dropped without the temperature dropping. You should be careful about finishing that sentence. Vard's face went a darker red. You threatening me? I'm suggesting you think before you speak. It's friendly advice. She looked at him without flinching. I came from a place where a man's land was taken and he was killed for refusing to give it up. That's what I brought here. Not trouble, or a warning. Whether anyone listens to it is their business. Vard took a step forward and Rhett was through the door and off the saloon steps before the step was completed. He didn't touch Vard. He just positioned himself, and the positioning made the geometry of the situation clear. Cullen, he said. Vard looked at him. The calculation in a drunk man's eyes was always slower than usual, which sometimes made it worse because you could watch it happening. Rhett saw him calculate whether he had enough of whatever it took to push this further. He apparently concluded he didn't. You've got a problem on your hands, Mercer, Vard said, whether you know it or not. Go inside, Rhett said. Sleep it off. Vard held his ground for another moment, pride requiring the pause, and then turned and went back through the saloon doors. The two men on the porch found other things to look at. The woman outside the dry goods store went inside. Rhett turned to Elena. She was loading the last of the supplies with the same methodical efficiency she'd shown before the interruption. You all right? He asked. Fine. She didn't look at him. He's not the first man who's talked at me like that. He won't be the last. I know. She tied off the wagon cover. What he said about me killing a man, where did that come from? I don't know yet. He climbed up onto the bench. But someone's spreading it. Question is whether it's just rumor or whether someone's laying ground. Laying ground for what? For whatever they do next. He took the reins. Come on. The ride back was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Elena sat straight and looked at the road ahead, and Rhett drove the horses and thought about the particular choreography of men like the Graves Syndicate, how they prepared the social territory before they moved on the physical one, how making someone a figure of suspicion and fear in the community they lived in made everything that happened to them afterward easier to justify or ignore. Rhett, she said, about halfway home. Yeah, the rumor about the killing. She paused. It's going to be true soon. He looked at her. Say that plainly. I mean, she chose her words with the care of someone who'd been thinking about this for longer than the conversation suggested. If they're sending riders out, if they're watching the property, eventually one of them is going to cross a line. And when that happens, I'm not going to wait to see what happens next. He drove for a while. The ridge came into view ahead of them, iron gray in the late afternoon. You'd be within your rights, he said. I know. She looked at him. I want to know if you'd stand by that. After. Elena. I need to know, before it happens. He thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind he could give her, and which was not as clean as he might have liked. He thought about the law in the territory, which was a complicated and selective instrument. He thought about Clara, who had been practical about violence in the way that people who had survived the frontier were often practical. Not casual about it, but clear that there were circumstances where it was the least terrible option available. Yes, he said. I'd stand by it. She nodded, once, and looked back at the road. Then we should talk about the north fence, she said. I found boot prints again this morning, different pair than last time. He'd seen them too. He'd been hoping she hadn't. How do you know they're different? Wider spacing, heavier person, or someone carrying weight? She looked at him. They're not doing surveys anymore. He knew she was right. The surveys were done. They knew what Iron Hollow had and what it would take to get it. The next stage was different. "We need to talk to Augusto tonight," he said. "I already talked to Augusto." He looked at her. "When?" "This morning, before the ride." She met his eyes steadily. "I hope that's all right." It was more than all right. It was exactly what needed to happen. And the fact that she'd done it without checking with him first was not a failure of protocol. It was the action of someone who understood that waiting on hierarchy in a crisis cost time you might not have. He recognized the judgment and respected it. "What did he say?" Rhett asked. "He knows a man in the Eastern Settlement, someone who worked land near Graves territory before he left. He thinks the man might know their patterns, how they move, what they do before they—" She stopped. "Before they stop being subtle." "I'll ride out tomorrow," Rhett said. "We'll ride out," she said, and there was no argument in it, just a correction of arithmetic. He didn't argue it. The man Augusto knew was named Ferris Doyle, and he lived in a small homestead about 6 miles east of Caldwell, in country that was less ridge and more flat, which meant his position was indefensible in most of the ways that mattered, and he knew it, which was evident from the first 5 minutes of conversation in the way he kept looking past Rhett and Elena toward the road. Doyle was a lean man in his late 50s with the look of someone who had made peace with being frightened. Not a coward. Rhett had seen enough actual cowards to know the difference. But a person who had made the rational calculation that the thing he'd once been willing to fight for was no longer worth the price, and who lived with that decision the way you live with a bad leg, functioning but not without cost. "I know the name," he said, when Rhett mentioned the Graves Syndicate. They were sitting in his small front room, which was clean in the way rooms are clean when they're lived in alone by someone with not much to do. "I knew it when they came to my land. I knew it when they offered a price that was about 60 cents on the dollar of what it was worth." He looked at his hands. "I knew it when I took the money." "No shame in surviving," Elena said. Doyle looked at her. Something passed across his face, recognition of some kind. "You're the one from the Voss place, aren't you? Word travels." "What word?" she asked. "That a young woman came through the territory with a story about what happened to her father's ranch. That she was at Iron Hollow." He shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry about your father, miss. Theodore Voss was a decent man. I met him once, at a cattle auction maybe 6 years back. He had opinions about everything and was right about half of them, which is a better average than most." Elena's expression changed in a way that was subtle and complete. The small, particular grief that comes from hearing someone you've lost described in the present tense of memory. She pressed her lips together and nodded. "What can you tell us about how they move?" Rhett asked. "When they're done with the surveys." Doyle leaned back. "They send someone in first that doesn't look like what they are. Legal type or a businessman. That's phase 1. He looked at them. "You've had that." "Yes," Rhett said. "Phase 2 is the community. They plant stories, make the target look like a problem, or unstable, or criminal. Makes it easier to do what comes next without people getting involved." He paused. "You had any of that?" "Working on it," Elena said. "Phase 3. He stopped, looked at the window. "Phase 3 is when they send someone who isn't there to talk." The room was very quiet. "How many?" Rhett asked. "Depends on the target. A place like yours, water rights, ridge position, they won't send one. Too valuable to risk losing." Doyle's voice had gone dry and factual, the voice of a man who had thought about this enough to have stripped the emotion out of it. 2, maybe 3. 1 to watch and 2 to move. They come at night. They look for what's not nailed down first. A fire here. Some stock going missing there. Things that say, "This is getting harder," without saying, "This is us." And if you don't read it right and act like it's all just bad luck, he spread his hands. It escalates. "And if you read it right," Elena said, "then it gets faster." He looked at her directly. "They don't like being read. They'd rather a slow burn than a confrontation they didn't control." "What's the move?" she said, for someone who's done being patient. Doyle studied her for a moment with the look of a man reassessing an initial impression. "Make noise," he said. "Not guns, not yet. Documentation. Talk to anyone who'll listen. Get visible. The Graves Syndicate works best in the dark. They hate light the way you'd expect." On the ride back to Iron Hollow, Elena was quiet for a long time. Rhett drove and let her think, which he'd learned was generally the most useful thing he could do when she was processing. Documentation, she said eventually. Letters, he said. Territory Land Office, the Federal Surveyor's Office. Anyone with a record. People who can be bought. Some, not all. He glanced at her. There's a woman at the Territory Land Office. Name is Margaret Hale. She's been there 15 years, and she's the reason 2 of the Graves Syndicate's legal maneuvers failed 3 years ago. They couldn't buy her. They tried. How do you know this? Clara knew her. A pause. Clara made it her business to know who couldn't be bought, said it was the most useful information on the frontier. Elena looked at him with the expression she got when something surprised her, and she was deciding how to respond to it. Your wife sounds like she was remarkable. She was, he said simply. She was also right about things in ways that took me years to catch up to, which was irritating but mostly productive. Elena almost smiled. It was becoming more common. The almost, the edge of it, the shape. He'd stopped pretending he didn't notice. I want to write to Margaret Hale, Elena said, and I want to start keeping a record. Everything we see, dated and described. Every rider who comes by, every boot print, every message. If they try to take this to law, I want a document that makes their story impossible. That's a good instinct, he said, and I want to talk to the other ranchers on the ridge. He looked at her. There are only 3 others in riding distance. I know. I've been thinking about it. She turned to face him more fully. If the Graves Syndicate is moving west, they're not just coming for Iron Hollow. They're coming for all of it. The other ranchers don't know yet what they're looking at when those survey men come around. She paused. They should know. It was the right thing to do, obviously. It was also a significant escalation of their position. Not defensive anymore, but active. Reaching out. Building something. Declaring without quite saying it that they were going to fight rather than wait to see if fighting became necessary. Rhett thought about it for the time it took to cover half a mile. The Langley place is closest, he said. Tom Langley. He's stubborn as a post, but he's fair. If he sees the logic in it, he'll listen. And the others? One at a time. She nodded. Looked at the road ahead. The ridge was doing its late afternoon thing where the light hit it at the angle that made it look almost like something you'd paint rather than work. He'd never been able to figure out if that made it more worth fighting for or just more complicated to feel about. Rhett, she said. Yeah. When this gets worse, she stopped. When it gets worse, not if. When it gets worse, he agreed. I need you to know that whatever happens, I didn't bring this to Iron Hollow on purpose. She was looking at the road, not at him. I know that what I'm carrying followed me here, and I know what that might cost you. I think about it. He drove for a moment. The horses moved with the steady rhythm they always had on the home stretch. They knew when they were close. The Graves Syndicate was coming to Iron Hollow regardless, he said. Clara's land office fight bought us time. We were always going to have this reckoning. Maybe, she said. Not maybe. He looked at her directly, making her meet his eyes. What you being here changed is that when it comes, I'm not facing it alone. He looked back at the road. That's not a cost. That's the opposite of a cost. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away. He could see the movement in her throat, the quick management of something she hadn't intended to show. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They crested the last rise, and Iron Hollow Ridge came into full view below them. The house, the barn, the fence lines, the creek catching late light to the south. Home in the most complicated sense of the word. Something worth the trouble it was about to take. Augusto had supper started. The horses went into their stalls with the relief of animals who'd earned their rest. Elena checked Dusk's water, and the mare bumped her shoulder with her nose in the particular way she'd developed, which was as close to affection as the horse's dignity allowed. They ate without much talking. Afterward, Elena sat at the table with paper and ink and began writing. Not one letter, several. To Margaret Hale at the land office, to the Territorial Surveyor's Record Department, to a newspaper editor in the Eastern Capital whose name she'd gotten from Ferris Doyle, and who had apparently written critically about land consolidation practices before and might be interested in writing again. Rhett watched her write from across the room. Her handwriting was tight and clear, the handwriting of someone who had been taught that penmanship was a form of respect for the reader. "You're going to tire your hand," he said. "I'll stop when I'm done," she said, without looking up. He shook his head and banked the fire and went to bed. He was almost asleep when he heard the sound, faint, distant, from somewhere out in the dark past the north fence. Not a crack, more of a thud, the kind of sound that livestock made when they were disturbed by something that didn't belong. He was up and dressed in 3 minutes. Elena was already in the hallway. They looked at each other in the dark. "North fence," she said. "I heard it." They went out into the cold together, rifles in hand, moving quiet across the yard toward the darkness that had started, it seemed, to move toward them. The dark past the north fence was the kind of dark that had texture to it. Not the clean darkness of an empty night, but the kind that had things moving inside it. Slow, deliberate movements that tried to imitate stillness and almost succeeded. Rhett had spent enough nights working land in bad weather and worse circumstances to know the difference between a ranch at rest and a ranch that was being watched, and what he was walking into now was the second thing, without question. Elena moved beside him with her rifle angled down, safety off, covering ground with the low-impact stride she'd developed over weeks of perimeter work. She didn't step on the frozen crust of the snow if she could avoid it. She moved around it. He noticed this the way he'd started to notice everything she did that was better than he'd taught her, which was most of it by now because she'd taken what he'd shown her and added something he couldn't teach, which was the particular focus of someone with a specific and personal reason to get things right. They came up to the north fence line from the east, which put the wind at their backs, which was wrong for smell, but right for sound. Sound carried better into a headwind, and whatever was out there, he wanted to hear it before it heard them. The cattle were bunched at the south end of the north pasture. That told him what he needed to know about direction. 2 o'clock, Elena said quietly. Just the words, no gesture. He saw it, a shape at the fence line, crouched low, working at the wire with something that caught a thread of moonlight. Wire cutters. Someone cutting the fence in the dark, slowly enough to avoid noise, which suggested they knew what they were doing and had done it before. Rhett raised his rifle. "Stop what you're doing," he said. Not loud, just enough to carry. The shape went completely still. "Stand up," he said. "Hands where I can see them." A long pause. Then the shape stood, hands coming up in the practiced way of someone who'd been in this position before. He was young, younger than Rhett had expected, maybe 25, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low. His face, when the moonlight caught it, was the face of someone who had concluded that the night had gone in a direction he hadn't planned for. "I was just," he started. "You were cutting my fence in the middle of the night," Rhett said. "Don't tell me what you were just doing." Elena had moved to the right while Rhett was talking, which put her at an angle that covered the darkness behind the man in case there was someone else back there. She did it without being told and without drawing attention to the movement, and Rhett filed it away as another thing she'd learned that he hadn't specifically taught her. "Is there anyone with you?" Elena asked. The young man looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, at being addressed by a woman in this context, or at the steadiness with which she held the rifle, or both. "No," he said. "Lie to me and I'll know," she said. "I'll know because I'll see them. I'm alone." His voice had a shake in it that he was trying to control. "I swear it. I'm alone." Rhett believed him, not because of the swearing, but because of the fence work. 2 people cutting fence would split the task and go faster. This man had been working alone, slow and quiet, which was more consistent with a solo job than a coordinated one. "Who sent you?" Rhett asked. "I just needed—" The young man stopped, swallowed. "I needed the work." "Who sent you?" Rhett said again, and this time it wasn't a question, it was a wall. More silence. The cattle shifted in their bunched group to the south, restless but not panicking. The night was very cold and very clear, and the stars were extraordinary in the way frontier stars were when there was no town light to argue with them. "Man named Bales," the young man said finally. He said it was a land dispute. He said I was helping settle a land dispute legally." "By cutting fence at 2 in the morning," Elena said. He had the decency to look ashamed. He made it sound different. What's your name? She asked. Jesse Craw. Jesse Craw. She lowered her rifle slightly, not all the way. How old are you? 22. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understood being young and broke and willing to believe what you needed to believe about the work you were doing. Here's what's going to happen, she said. You're going to tell us everything Bales told you. Where he is, what he planned, who else is involved, and then you're going to ride east and not come back to this territory. Jesse looked at Rhett as if checking whether this was the real offer or a setup for something worse. Rhett just watched him. And if I don't? Jesse said. Jesse. Then what happens next isn't something I'm willing to predict, Elena said. But the men who hired you aren't going to help you with it. That much I can promise. It took about 40 minutes, all told. Jesse Craw told them what he knew, which was limited in the way that disposable people were always limited. He knew his piece and no more. But his piece was enough. Bales was operating out of a property about 12 miles south, a former relay station that the syndicate had apparently converted into a field office. There were at least 6 other men there. The fence cutting was intended to start a pattern, small damages that accumulated, that made Iron Hollow look troubled, that preceded a formal legal challenge claiming mismanagement of the water rights. They're going to claim the water rights aren't being properly maintained, Elena said, when Jesse had gone, heading east with nothing but what he'd come with and considerably more sense than he'd arrived with. That's the legal angle. They get a friendly assessor to document the damaged fence, the loose cattle, and then they have grounds to challenge Clara's water claim. Clara's claim is solid, Rhett said. Against an honest process, yes. Against a bought one, she left it there. They walked back toward the house through the dark. The fence would need repair in the morning, which was irritating but manageable. What wasn't manageable was the field office 12 miles south and 6 men in it, and a strategy that had clearly moved into its operational phase. We need to go to Tom Langley tomorrow, Elena said. Not next week. Tomorrow. Agreed. And we should tell Augusto what we found tonight. He'll already know something happened, Rhett said. That man doesn't sleep as deep as he pretends. As if to prove the point, the kitchen light was on when they got back to the house. Augusto was sitting at the table with his coffee. He looked at them, looked at the rifles, looked back at his coffee. How many? He said. Just one, Rhett said. Young. They sent him to cut fence. Augusto considered this. One is a test, he said. They're measuring response time. I know. Next time is not a test. I know that too. Augusto nodded and finished his coffee and went back to bed without further comment, which was, in its way, the most useful possible response. Rhett and Elena sat in the kitchen after he'd gone. The fire was low but still working. Outside, the night had gone back to its regular dark. You should sleep, he said. I know. She didn't move. She was looking at the table surface with the focus of someone working something out that hadn't resolved yet. Rhett. Yeah. The letters I sent to Margaret Hale and the others. She looked up. Even if they respond, even if everything works the way it's supposed to work, she paused. The men in that relay station 12 miles south aren't waiting on letters. No, he said. So we need 2 tracks running at the same time, the legal one and the other one. The other one, he repeated, not quite a question. Whatever it takes to make Iron Hollow too expensive to take. She said it plainly, the way she said most things that other people would have wrapped in qualifications. Not just offended, expensive, so that the math stops working for them. He thought about that, about what making Iron Hollow genuinely costly would require. Not just a rifle at the fence line on a cold night, but something more organized, more visible, more deliberate, something that would require help. Langley tomorrow, he said again. And the Mercer name still means something in this territory, she said, more than you use it for. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means you have standing here. You have history. People remember your wife fighting that land office battle and winning. She held his gaze. That's a resource. I'm not sure you've thought about using it. He hadn't, not deliberately. He'd maintained the standing the way you maintained a fence, consistently, practically, without thinking of it as an asset rather than a responsibility. You're saying I should be louder, he said. I'm saying you should be visible, she said. There's a difference. Loud is just noise. Visible is a statement. He thought about Clara, who had been visible in precisely the way Elena was describing. Not showy, not aggressive, but present in every room that mattered, known by every person who counted, impossible to overlook or dismiss. He thought about how he'd watched her do it for 15 years and had always attributed her effectiveness to personality rather than strategy, when in fact it had been both. "My wife," he said, "would have liked you considerably." Elena blinked. It was the most unguarded he'd seen her face in weeks. "That's—" She stopped. "Thank you. That means something." "It should," he said, and got up and banked the fire for the night. Tom Langley was the kind of man who expressed skepticism through silence and agreement through work, and the fact that he spent the first 10 minutes of their conversation saying absolutely nothing before standing up and putting his coat on was, Elena learned, the highest possible endorsement. "The Mercer water rights," Langley said, as they rode back, the three of them now. "They go. Mine are next in the chain." "Yes," Rhett said. "Why didn't you come to me earlier?" "Didn't want to bring trouble to your door until I was sure it was coming anyway." Langley considered this. "It was already at my door," he said. "That survey man came through in January." "Bales?" "Called himself something else. Same type." He spat to the side. "I've seen the type before. My father lost land to men like that." He looked at the ridge ahead. "Won't happen again." The other ranchers were varied in their responses. One, a nervous man named Eustace Cole, who ran a small sheep operation, said he wanted no part of it, and please leave him out of whatever was coming, which they respected. The other, a woman named Ruth Gallagher, who'd run her dead husband's cattle operation for 11 years, with the compressed efficiency of someone who'd learned to do two people's jobs and had stopped being interested in doing less, listened to everything they said, and then asked 3 specific questions about the syndicate's legal strategy, and then said, "When do we start?" By the time the spring mud season arrived, they had something that hadn't existed before. Not quite an alliance, but an understood arrangement between 4 properties that shared a perimeter and a problem. Information moved between them faster. Movements on one property were noticed by neighbors in ways they hadn't been before. It wasn't a militia, and it wasn't a committee. It was just people who decided that the isolation the syndicate was counting on was a choice they were no longer making. The relay station 12 miles south was the thing that didn't resolve cleanly. Elena thought about it the way she thought about the north fence, as a problem with the geography, something that could be mapped. She rode within sight of it twice, at distances that gave her look without being seen, and what she saw was not reassuring. 6 men had become 8. There were horses she didn't recognize, a wagon with a canvas cover that hadn't been there the first time. She brought this back to Rhett without editorializing, which was how she'd learned to give him information, clean, organized, without the emotional charge that came from having been the one to gather it in the cold, on a horse at 6 in the morning. "The wagon," he said, "could be supplies, could be something else." She sat down across the table from him. "I want to know what's under the canvas." "You're not riding closer to that station." "I know. I wasn't suggesting it." She paused. "Augusto knows a man who used to run the relay station before the syndicate took it over. He might know the layout." "I'll talk to Augusto." "I already—" She stopped, caught herself. "I already asked him if he knew anyone." Rhett looked at her. "Old habit," she said, not apologetically. "I'm used to moving fast." "Elena," he kept his voice level, "this isn't your operation to run alone." "I know it isn't." She looked at him directly. "I also know that I see things you don't see. Not because I'm better. Because I'm looking at it differently. My father's land was taken because he worked alone and refused help." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not making that mistake, but working together doesn't mean I wait for permission to think." He held her gaze for a moment. She was right, which didn't make it less complicated. He'd been running Iron Hollow on his own terms for so long that someone else's initiative in his own kitchen still triggered a resistance that he knew was more habit than logic. "Fair enough," he said. "What did Augusto say?" The spring brought with it Margaret Hale. She arrived on a Thursday, unannounced, in a rented buggy from Caldwell that had clearly not enjoyed the road to Iron Hollow Ridge. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with reading spectacles pushed up into iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had spent 15 years fighting bureaucratic battles and had developed a face that gave away nothing until she'd decided to give it. She accepted coffee, looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of someone taking inventory, and put a stack of documents on the table. "Your letters were detailed," she said to Elena. "I appreciated the dates." "My mother taught me that documentation is the only argument that doesn't need a voice," Elena said. "Smart woman." Hill sorted through the documents. "The water rights claim that Clara Mercer established in 1879 is among the most carefully recorded in the territory. That's fortunate for you." She looked up at Rhett. "Your wife was thorough." "She was," he said. "She was also right, which is why 2 previous attempts to challenge it failed." Hale put her finger on a specific document. "This is the challenge they filed last month. Quiet filing. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't been specifically looking after your letter. They used a proxy name." She looked at Elena. "You were right about the legal strategy. They're claiming water mismanagement based on fence damage and livestock disturbance records they've apparently been compiling." "Records they created," Elena said. "Yes, but that requires proving it, which is easier now than it would have been without your own records." Hale leaned back. "Here's where things stand. I can fight this at the territory level. I have the standing, and I have the evidence. What I cannot do is make the men at that relay station 12 miles south into something that is primarily a legal problem." "We know," Rhett said. "They're going to push physically when the legal channel slows down," she said. "Which it will, because I'm going to slow it down considerably." She looked between them. "So I need you to tell me what you're planning for when that happens." The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was the silence of people deciding how much to say to someone they'd only just met. "We're planning to be ready," Elena said. Hale looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to judge what ready means in this context. I've worked the territory long enough to know that the law is a season behind the reality." She picked up her coffee. "I'm asking because what happens here is going to matter to more than just Iron Hollow. If the Graves Syndicate is challenged successfully, legally and otherwise, it sets a precedent that protects a dozen other properties across the territory." "We know," Elena said again, and this time there was something in her voice that was older than her years. Hale left them with copies of everything she'd filed and promises of follow-through that, unlike most promises in Rhett's experience, came backed by a 15-year track record of follow-through. The legal channel was slower than the men at the relay station, but it was real, and having it running in parallel changed the shape of what was coming. It was in the last week of March that the Graves Syndicate ran out of patience. The first sign was the missing cattle, 11 head from the east pasture, gone between nightfall and morning with no signs of panic or stampede, just simply gone. Professional work. Someone who knew how to move cattle quietly in the dark. The second sign was the fire, not the house. They'd anticipated the house, and Augusto had been sleeping in the barn loft for 2 weeks with a rifle across his knees, which had irritated him considerably, but which he'd agreed to without much argument. What they didn't anticipate was the south fence dry grass, which caught in the night and burned a quarter-mile of pasture before the wind turned and starved it of fuel. The cattle survived. The fencing was destroyed. Rhett stood at the burned edge in the morning gray and looked at the line of char and the twisted fence wire and felt something settle in his chest that was past anger and past fear. It was the particular calm that came when the uncertainty was finally over and the shape of the thing was clear. Elena stood beside him. "They're done testing," she said. "Yes. We have maybe a week, maybe less." "Yes." She looked at the burned fence. "I know the north approach better than any of them do," she said. "I've been riding it for 3 months." "Elena." And Ruth Gallagher's son served 2 years as a territory marshal before he came back to help his mother. He knows organized engagement in ways neither of us do. She was very calm, the stillness of something that has decided. "We bring them here. Langley, Gallagher, her son. We don't wait for them to come to us." He looked at her. The morning light was thin and flat and honest in the way of spring mornings that hadn't committed to warmth yet. "You want to go to them," he said. "I want to make them come to us on ground we've prepared," she said. "Not the same thing." She met his eyes. "We ride to their relay station, not to fight there. To make them know we know where they are. To make them come at us before they're ready. She paused. Fear makes men rush, and rushed men make mistakes. It was bold in the way that things born from months of patience are bold. Not reckless, not hot-blooded, but deliberately calculated to shift the terms of the confrontation from theirs to hers. He'd been turning it over in his own mind for weeks, the tactical shape of what was coming, and he'd arrived at the same general place through a different route. Langley won't like it, he said. Tom Langley will do what makes sense, she said. Once it makes sense to him. He took one more look at the burned fence line. The char smell was still heavy in the cold air. 11 cattle somewhere, driven east by men who did this for money and didn't think about what they were taking. All right, he said. They rode to the relay station on a Tuesday morning, which was deliberately chosen because it was the most ordinary day available. No market day, no stage, nothing that would explain a group of riders on the road to anyone watching from a distance. Rhett and Elena, Tom Langley, and Ruth Gallagher's son, Cade, who was a compact, quiet man of 30 with the economy of movement that came from years of working situations where extra movement could get you killed. They didn't ride to the station. They rode to the ridge above it, where they could be seen from the station yard if anyone was looking, which they would be, because the syndicate had lookouts the same way any operation in hostile territory had lookouts. They stopped on the ridge, and they sat there on their horses in plain view for a solid 10 minutes, not armed dramatically, just visibly. Just there. Then Elena rode forward to the edge of the slope, alone, close enough that anyone in the yard below could see her face clearly if they had field glasses, which they did. She could see the glint of them. She sat there for about 30 seconds, then she turned her horse and rode back to the group. Done, she said. That's it? Cade Gallagher asked. That's enough, she said. She was right. The message was simple and it didn't require elaboration. We know where you are. We are not afraid to be seen knowing it. Whatever you are planning, plan it knowing we're not waiting in the dark for you to choose the moment. They rode back to Iron Hollow in a group and separated at the ridge road with brief words and the understanding that the next time they gathered, it would be for something more than a statement. The wait after that was 4 days. 4 days of ordinary work that wasn't ordinary, feeding horses and checking fence lines and making coffee with the awareness, always, of the perimeter. Augusto back in the barn loft at night. Elena sleeping lighter than she had in months, which was saying something. Rhett doing the thing he did when tension peaked, which was fix things. He repaired the south fence line himself, working methodically through the burned section, replacing wire and post with the focused attention of a man putting something in order that might soon be disordered again. On the 4th night, they came. Not 2 or 3 this time. Riders, plural. Rhett counted 7 from the porch before he had to get off the porch, and he suspected there were more he hadn't counted. They came up the road openly, which was either confidence or provocation or both, and the man in front was not Bales. It was someone older, heavier, with a look of seniority rather than employment. Someone who had decided to come personally, which meant something had changed in their calculation. Elena was already at the east corner of the house when Rhett came off the porch, which meant she'd seen them coming before he had. Augusto appeared at the barn door, and from the north, moving quietly along the fence line in a way that suggested they'd come the long way to avoid being heard on the road, were Tom Langley and Cade Gallagher. The riders stopped about 30 yards from the gate. The man in front looked at the house, looked at the positions of the people around it, and his face did something complicated. "Mercer," he called out. Rhett walked to the gate but didn't open it. "Who are you?" "Name's Garrett Pell." He said it like it should mean something. "I represent a collection of business interests with a formal claim to resources on this property." "The claim was filed fraudulently," Rhett said. "The Territory Land Office has been notified and the filing is under review." He kept his voice even. "You've wasted a trip." Pell looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena, who was at the corner of the house with her rifle neither raised nor lowered, just present. "That woman," Pell said. "She's not your concern, Mercer. She's ours." The yard went very quiet. "She's not anyone's," Rhett said, and the evenness in his voice was the most dangerous thing about it. "And neither is this land. That's not going to change." Pell looked at the positions around the yard again. He was counting, the same way Rhett had counted, and whatever number he arrived at, it was doing something to his confidence. "This doesn't have to go badly," Pell said. "No." Elena said from her corner. Her voice carried clearly across the cold air. It doesn't. But that's your choice to make, not ours. Pell looked at her directly. Something passed across his face. Recognition of the shape of the situation, of how it had gotten rearranged since whatever briefing he'd received before riding up here. He'd expected frightened people. He'd arrived at something else. He turned his horse. We'll be back, he said. We'll be here, Rhett said. The riders went back down the road, all 7 of them. And the 4 people at Iron Hollow stood in the cold and watched them go, and nobody said anything until the last sound of hooves had faded. Cade Gallagher exhaled slowly. They'll regroup, he said. I know, Elena said. Next time they won't stop at the gate. I know that too. She looked at Rhett. We have a day. Maybe 2. She said it without drama, just the flat geography of the situation. We should use it. He nodded. His heart was still doing something that would have embarrassed him to describe, and his hands had that particular steadiness that came from adrenaline being managed rather than released. He looked at her, at the corner of his house, rifle at her side, eyes clear, and thought about Ferris Doyle saying they hate light the way you'd expect, and about Clara saying the land responds to what you do with it, and about the boot prints in the snow 3 months ago, and everything that had happened between then and now. Then let's get to work, he said. The day they had turned out to be exactly 1 day. Pell's riders came back the following evening, just before the light went, which was chosen deliberately. The hour that was too dark for clear shooting and too light for the darkness to hide movement completely. The hour that sat in the uncomfortable middle and gave neither side a clean advantage. Rhett had anticipated this, or something close to it, which was why he'd spent the daylight hours doing things that the men coming up the road had not anticipated. The preparations were not elegant. They were the work of people with limited time and practical minds, and no interest in anything beyond making Iron Hollow as costly as possible for the people who wanted it. Elena had mapped the approaches 3 months ago, and that mapping had been revised and revised again until she knew every angle, every shadow, every piece of ground that gave cover, and every piece that didn't. Cade Gallagher, drawing on his martial years with the particular economy of someone who'd learned to prepare for violence without becoming comfortable with it, helped her translate the map into positions. Augusto reinforced the barn doors and moved the horses to the back stalls and did not complain about any of it, which was its own form of courage. Langley covered the east approach on his own horse with his own rifle and his own reasons, which were private but sufficient. Rhett walked the perimeter one final time in the last of the daylight. He was checking things he'd already checked, which he recognized as the behavior of a man who needed to be moving rather than waiting, and he made no apology for it. Elena fell into step beside him at the north corner. You should be at your position, he said. I'm going. I wanted to... She stopped, started again. I wanted to say something before this starts. He looked at her. The light was going fast, the ridge going dark above them, and her face in the low gold of it was very clear. He'd stopped pretending, at least to himself, that he didn't notice her face. Say it then, he said. If something goes wrong tonight... Elena, let me finish. Her voice was steady. If something goes wrong, I need you to know that what you did, taking me in, not asking for anything, letting me find my way back to something... She pressed her lips together for a moment. That mattered more than I'll probably ever say correctly. So I'm saying it now in case later is complicated. He looked at her for a moment. The honest answer was complicated in ways he didn't have time to be complicated, so he gave her the part of it that was simple. Nothing's going to go wrong, he said, but I hear you. She held his gaze. That's not what I asked you to say. I know. He looked at the ridge. What you did matters too, Elena. Coming back from what happened to you, choosing to stand here instead of keep running. He looked back at her. That's not a small thing. She nodded, once, something in her face that she didn't try to manage. Go to your position, he said, not unkindly. She went. He stood at the north corner alone for about 30 seconds, looking at the ridge and the darkening sky. And he thought about Clara with the particular clearness he'd learned to allow himself, not the grief of it, which was always there, but the actual memory of her, sharp-edged and specific. He thought about what she would have said standing here right now, and the answer came so immediately that it almost had her voice on it. Well, Rhett, you going to stand there all night or are you going to do something useful? He went to his position, The riders came up the road in two groups, which told him Cade had been right about the reorganization. Not 7 men openly on the road this time, 4 on the road, which was meant to draw attention, and another group coming through the east field under cover of the tree line, which was meant to be the actual move. He knew about the east group because Ruth Gallagher's property backed onto that tree line, and Ruth had sent her youngest hand to watch it, and the hand had come running 40 minutes before dark with the information. It was not a sophisticated plan, but it didn't need to be. It had numbers and the assumption of surprise, and if the assumption had been correct, it would have worked. The assumption was not correct. The 4 men on the road stopped at the gate. Pell wasn't among them this time, which told Rhett that Pell had either left the operation or had decided to be somewhere else when the rough work happened, either of which told him something useful about Pell's character. "Mercer," the man at the front called out. "Last chance." Rhett stepped onto the porch. Not hidden, visible, deliberate, the same visibility Elena had put into practice from the beginning. Last chance at what? Take the offer. Walk away from this property. You'll be compensated fair and you'll be alive, which is better than the alternative. "I've been on this land for 20 years, Rhett said. "My wife is buried here. I'm not walking away from it, and the alternative you're describing doesn't scare me as much as you need it to." A pause from the man at the gate. Then he made a small gesture with his left hand, which was the signal to the east group, and in the tree line things began to move. What happened next was not clean. Rhett had never been in a situation that was clean, and he'd learned young that anyone who described violence as clean had either not seen enough of it or was lying about what they'd seen. What it was controlled. Controlled in the specific sense that the people defending Iron Hollow had prepared for it, and the people attacking it had not prepared for the defense they encountered. Cade Gallagher was at the south end of the east tree line. He fired a warning shot, one, high, unmistakable, and then identified himself loudly as a former territory marshal, which had no legal weight in his current capacity, but had considerable psychological weight on men who were used to operations where no one had official history. 2 of the east group broke off immediately. The other 2 did not, and the situation at the east fence became the worst moment of the night. 2 frightened men with guns making bad decisions in bad light, and the outcome of it was not clean and it was not good, but it ended with no one dead at Iron Hollow and 2 men on the ground who needed medical attention that Rhett, profoundly against his natural inclinations, saw they received before anything else was dealt with. At the gate, the 4 on the road made a different calculation. They were looking at a house that had more coverage than they'd expected, at positions they couldn't see clearly, at a situation that was not the disorganized target they'd been promised. The man who'd made the offer to Rhett looked at the porch, looked at the darkness around the house that could be hiding anything, and pulled his horse around. "This isn't over," he said. "It is for tonight," Rhett said. They left, not retreating fast, pride wouldn't allow that, but leaving with the particular determination of men recalculating. The night after that was very quiet. They tended what needed tending, which was considerable. Cade had a cut on his left arm from a piece of fence wire that had caught him in the dark. Not deep, but long, and it needed cleaning. One of Langley's horses had been spooked badly enough to throw a shoe and twist an ankle on the uneven ground and needed care. The barn had taken a hit from something incendiary, small, low grade, but enough to char a section of the east wall before Augusto got it with water and a blanket, and the horses had not been calm about it. Elena came in from the east fence at close to midnight. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her rifle down and sat there without moving for a while. Rhett made coffee without asking if she wanted any and put it in front of her without comment. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "The 2 men at the east fence," she said. "They'll live," he said. "Both of them. I've sent for the doctor from Caldwell." Cade's fine. The cut's nothing serious." She nodded. She looked at the table. He could see her going through whatever internal accounting she needed to do after something like this. Not guilt exactly, because she'd done nothing that wasn't warranted, but the weight that comes from having been part of the machinery that produced a night like this one. He understood the weight. He was carrying his own version of it. "They'll come back," she said. Not a question. "Yes, but differently." He sat down across from her. Tonight changed the math. They expected an undefended property and a frightened woman and a middle-aged rancher who'd fold. They got something else.
They'll have to go back to whoever's running this and make a new plan. How long does that buy us? Enough time for Margaret Hale's challenge to create real trouble for them in the land office. He paused. And enough time for what comes next. She looked up at him. What comes next?
The territorial authorities, he said. I've been avoiding it because authorities in this territory have been bought before. But Cade has contacts from his marshal years that go higher than the local level, federal contacts. He met her eyes. It's time to use them. She considered this. That's a bigger step than we've taken before. Yes, but tonight we created evidence that this is no longer a property dispute handled quietly. There are 2 men with gunshot wounds and a burned barn wall and witnesses from 4 separate ranches. He let that sit. That's a federal case if anyone chooses to see it as one. Will they? Cade thinks so, with the right documentation and the right pressure. He paused. And with your account of your father's ranch. That's the piece that connects everything. That this isn't isolated, that it's a pattern. Something moved across her face. The account of her father's ranch meant reliving it formally, on record, with her name attached to it in a way that removed the possibility of remaining quiet. I can do that, she said after a moment. I know you can. He looked at her. I'm asking if you're willing. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked up. My father didn't have anyone standing next to him, she said quietly. He made his stand alone, and it killed him. She straightened slightly. I'm not alone. So yes, I'm willing. He nodded. Rhett. She said his name with a weight to it that made him meet her eyes fully. Yeah. When this is over. When it's actually over. She stopped, seemed to organize something internal. I don't know what I am here, what I'm supposed to be. He understood what she was saying. The ambiguity of her position, arrived as a stranger, stayed as something that didn't have a clean category, working the land with the investment of someone who belonged to it, without the formal claim of belonging. You're what you've made yourself here, he said, which is someone this ridge wouldn't function without. She looked at him steadily. That's not what I meant. He knew it wasn't. He was quieter for a moment, sitting with the thing he'd been sitting with for weeks. The recognition that whatever was growing between them had been growing whether he'd wanted it to or not, and that the avoidance of naming it was its own kind of decision. I know what you meant, he said. I'm not ready to say all of it tonight, but I'm not pretending I don't see what's here. She held his gaze. Her eyes in the low firelight were that complicated gray, full of things she was choosing not to hide. All right, she said quietly. That's enough for tonight. All right, he said. They sat with the coffee going cold between them and the fire working itself down, and the quiet of the house after a hard night settling around them like something that had earned its rest. Garrett Pell came to Caldwell 11 days later. Not to Iron Hollow, to Caldwell, which was notable, which was intentional, which was the behavior of a man who'd decided that the visible approach was no longer working and was trying the institutional one. He met with the local land commissioner, a man named Birch, who had a comfortable relationship with the syndicate's money, and he filed an accelerated challenge that bypassed the normal review process and applied directly to a territorial court in the capital. Margaret Hale sent a letter the same day she heard about it, which was 2 days after it happened, which was how fast information moved when you had 15 years of knowing who to talk to. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again. They're escalating legally, she said, trying to move faster than the federal inquiry can establish itself. Yes, Rhett said. Can Hale stop it? Slow it down, not stop it without the federal piece. He sat down. We need to move on Cade's contacts. This week, not next. I'll write the account today, she said. Everything. The Voss Ranch, the date, the men's descriptions, everything I saw. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she'd decided something, and the deciding was the hard part. And what came after was just execution. It'll be complete. Elena, you don't have to do it all today. Yes, I do, she said, because if I wait, it gets harder. And it's already hard enough. She looked at him. Do you have paper? He brought her paper. She wrote for 4 hours. He left her alone for most of it, finding work in the barn and the yard, the kind of physical work that gave a person privacy without abandonment. Augusto, with his usual reading of the room, stayed out of the kitchen entirely. When she finished, she brought him the pages. 12 of them, dense and careful and chronological. The arrival of the syndicate's men, the escalating pressure, the night her father was killed, her flight, the weeks after. Names where she had them, descriptions where she didn't, dates, details. The kind of documentation that Clara would have recognized and respected. He read it without interrupting. When he finished, he set it down. "This is good," he said. "This is very good." Her face was tired in a way that was different from physical exhaustion. "It's accurate," she said. "Whether it's good depends on what they do with it." Cade Gallagher rode with her to meet his federal contact, a man who operated out of a larger town 2 days east, which meant 2 days of riding and 2 days back and a meeting in the middle that would either move the federal inquiry forward or confirm that the syndicate's reach went higher than they'd hoped. Rhett wanted to go. He made himself stay because Iron Hollow couldn't be unattended and because he trusted Cade's read of the situation, and because some part of him understood that Elena needed to do this particular piece herself, to put her father's story in front of the people with the power to do something about it, in her own words, with her own voice. She came back on the 5th day, which was a day longer than planned, and which cost Rhett more sleep than he was going to admit. She and Cade came up the road in the late afternoon, horses tired, riders equally so, and Elena's face when she came through the gate had the look of someone who had done something that cost them, but that they didn't regret. "Well?" Rhett said. Rhett tissit.
"He took the account," she said. "All of it. He read it in front of us, and he asked questions, and he—" She stopped. He knew the name Graves. Not from this territory, from somewhere east, years back. He said he'd been trying to build a case against the organization for 2 years, and he was missing the pattern. She looked at Rhett directly. "My father's ranch was the pattern." Rhett was quiet.
"Theodore Voss's death," she said, "is going into a federal filing." Her voice was steady, and it cost her to keep it that way. "That's going into a record, with his name and mine." He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, the way you touch someone when words were beside the point. She put her hand over his for a moment. Then she straightened. "Pell knows something happened," Cade said from behind her. "His man in Caldwell will tell him about the federal contact soon enough. When he finds out, he's going to move fast. We've probably got a week before he makes his last push." "Then we have a week," Rhett said. The week was used well. The letters Elena had sent months ago, the ones to the newspaper editor, the ones to the territory's independent press, began producing results she hadn't expected this quickly. 2 articles appeared in the eastern papers, one of which named the Graves Syndicate by name and cited a pattern of land acquisition by coercion across 3 territories. The articles were not perfect. One of them got details wrong, which frustrated Elena considerably, and one of them sensationalized the story in ways she found embarrassing. But they existed, which was different from not existing. And existence had its own force. Aldous Penn at the general store in Caldwell stopped finding reasons to make transactions difficult. Tom Langley told Rhett on a Thursday that 3 ranchers from the neighboring valley had sent word asking to meet, having read the newspaper piece and recognized their own situation in it. "It's spreading," Langley said. Not with excitement, with the tone of a man who understood that spreading meant more complexity as well as more support. "People are watching." "Good," Rhett said. "Let them watch." The final confrontation at Iron Hollow came on a night in early April when the snow had retreated to the high slopes and the ground was soft with new mud, and the ridge had the complicated green-brown of country coming back to life after winter. Pell came this time with 12 men. Not from the road, not pretending anymore at process. Through the north fence at 3 a.m, wire cut in 6 places, horses and men moving fast in the dark without the careful quiet of the first approaches. Past patience, past strategy. Just force. Applied directly, which was what you got when everything else failed. But Elena had known they were coming before they came. She didn't explain afterward exactly how she'd known, only that she'd been watching the north fence pattern for weeks, and something about the last 2 days of stillness felt wrong in a way that stillness shouldn't feel wrong, and that she'd told Rhett on Wednesday evening that it was coming soon, and Rhett had believed her the way he'd learned to believe her about things she'd earned the right to know. The positions were set by midnight. Langley and 2 of his men along the north fence approach. Cade at the barn, which was the natural second objective after the house. Augusto, who had stopped pretending this was someone else's fight about 3 months ago, at the south corner with a rifle he'd owned for 15 years and knew well enough to use in the dark. And Elena on the roof of the house, which was a position no one had suggested to her and which she had selected herself on the basis of sightline and coverage, climbing up before the others had finished setting their positions and settling in with the Winchester, and a patience that had been built over months from the raw material of grief. Rhett took the front. He was at the gate when the 12 men broke through the north fence, and the sound of them breaking through it was the signal that everything moved at once. Not chaos, but the orchestrated response of people who had prepared for exactly this. Langley's men hit the north group from a flank position that the riders hadn't accounted for. Cade sealed the barn. Augusto made himself known at the south corner with a shot that went into the ground in front of the lead horse of the south flanking group, which brought the horse up short and created a delay that cost the timing of the whole operation. Pell rode through this gate himself, which Rhett hadn't expected and which suggested either bravery or desperation. He hadn't decided which. Pell came through the open gate on a gray horse at speed and pulled up in the middle of the yard and looked around at what was happening to his 12 men and then looked at Rhett, standing 20 feet away in the yard. "You should have taken the money," Pell said. His voice was tight. He was still playing something. Businessman, aggrieved party. Even now. "Mercer should have," Rhett said. "But his wife built this land, and I'm not in the habit of selling other people's work." Pell reached for his holster. What came from the roof was a single shot that hit the yard 6 inches from Pell's horse's right forehoof, and the horse went sideways and Pell went with it, barely staying on, and when he recovered his position, his hand was very far from his holster. He looked up. Elena was on the roof. Rifle up. Not at him. Not aimed at him, because she was smarter than that, and she'd learned the difference between force and murder over months of thinking it through. But close enough to him to make the arithmetic of trying again very clear. "The federal inquiry has your name," she said from the roof, in a voice that carried across the yard cleanly. "And the names of the Graves Syndicate leadership, and 23 affidavits from ranchers across 3 territories." She paused. "You came here for water rights and a piece of ridgeland. What you've actually built for yourself is a federal case." Pell looked at her, then looked at the yard around him, the positions, the coverage, the coordinated response he'd ridden into. "Right away," she said. "All of you, tonight. And don't come back to this territory." She kept her voice level. "Because the next time there won't be a warning shot." It was not dramatic. It was not the way these things happened in stories told afterward by people who hadn't been there. What it was? A man on a gray horse in the middle of a yard making a calculation, and the calculation coming out one way instead of another, and Pell turning his horse and riding back through the gate he'd come through, and the 12 men, those who were able, following him out into the spring dark. 4 of them weren't able and needed attending to. The accounting of that night was carried quietly, the way such things were carried in the territory, by the people present, without announcement, without satisfaction. There was no satisfaction. There was just the after. Elena came down from the roof stiff and cold, which she hadn't acknowledged while she was up there, and acknowledged now in the way she moved. Rhett saw it and said nothing, just walked beside her to the porch. She sat on the porch steps, and he sat beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. The sky was going gray at the eastern edge. The ridge above them was dark and still. "It's not over," she said. The legal piece keeps moving," he said. "But they won't come back here, not physically." He looked at the gate. "Whatever comes next is paper and process. That's a different fight." She leaned back against the porch post. She was very tired. He could see it in her with a specificity that came from months of paying attention. Not just the tiredness of the night, but the accumulated tiredness of everything before it. All the way back to a train station in a storm and a woman with frozen hands who hadn't yet decided whether she was staying or going. "My father," she said. Yeah, he would have hated every moment of this. She almost smiled. He'd have waded in alone and gotten himself killed again. A pause. But he'd have been proud of the roof position. Rhett made a sound that was almost a laugh. The roof position was good. "I know." She looked at the ridge. "I knew it was good when I thought of it." He looked at her beside him on the porch step, and the gray light was doing the thing it did at this hour. making everything flat and honest and without the mercy of shadow. And he thought about what it meant that she was still here, that she'd chosen to stay and fight for land that wasn't legally hers, that she'd climbed onto the roof of his house in the dark to cover a yard full of armed men with a rifle and a patience that he couldn't fully account for. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "Stay," he said. Not as instruction, as what it actually was, which was something he'd been working up to for 3 months and had run out of reasons to keep working up to. Not just because of the legal fight. Stay because this is... He stopped. He wasn't good at this. He'd never been good at it. Because this is yours now, same as mine. Because you've made it that. She looked at him for a long time, and the gray light was in her eyes, and she wasn't going to make it easy for him by saying it first, which he'd expected. "Ask me properly," she said. "What?" "Ask me. Not stay. Ask me what you actually mean." He looked at her. He recognized the fairness of the demand. He thought about Clara telling him, more times than he'd deserved, that the problem was he always said the close thing instead of the exact thing and expected people to fill in the gap. "Will you make this your home?" he said. "With me. Whatever that looks like, whatever it takes to build." He held her gaze. "Will you stay here and make something with me that's worth staying for?" She was quiet for a moment. The ridge was brightening slowly above them, the first real suggestion of warmth working its way into the sky. "Yes," she said, simply, without conditions. He nodded. She turned back to look at the ridge. They sat there together on the porch steps while the light came back, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. Augusto came out of the barn an hour later, took one look at them on the porch, and went back inside to make breakfast without saying a word. He made enough for 3, which he'd been doing since February. The paper fight lasted 14 months. That was the part nobody told stories about afterward. The 14 months of letters and filings and counterfilings, and the particular exhaustion of fighting people who had money enough to make the process itself into a weapon. The Graves Syndicate didn't come back to Iron Hollow physically after that April night. They came back through proxies and attorneys and friendly commissioners and every administrative mechanism that money could reach, and the fighting of it was not dramatic, and it was not the kind of thing that made good telling, but it was real, and it was grinding, and it cost everyone involved something they didn't entirely get back. Margaret Hale worked the Territory Land Office with the focused persistence of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 15 years. She filed challenges to every procedural irregularity she could document, and she could document most of them because Elena's records, those careful, dated, methodical pages that had been accumulating since February of the previous year, gave her a foundation that couldn't be argued away. The federal inquiry Cade had opened moved slowly, the way federal things moved, but it moved, and the fact of its movement changed what the syndicate's attorneys were willing to put their names on. Elena wrote more letters. She wrote to every rancher in 3 territories whose name had come up in connection with Graves operations. Some didn't write back. Some wrote back with anger. At her, at the situation, at the implicit accusation that they hadn't done enough to protect themselves or their neighbors, which was its own kind of pain, and she tried to receive it without judgment. Several wrote back with information that went directly to the federal file and strengthened it in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was not always good at this. She was better at the physical work of the ranch than at the diplomatic work of building coalitions. And there were weeks when the correspondence made her short-tempered, and the short temper came out sideways at the people closest to her, which meant Rhett and Augusto absorbed things they hadn't earned. Rhett generally absorbed them without comment and waited for the weather to change, which was the same strategy he used for actual weather, and it worked about as well. Augusto made coffee and said nothing, which was his preferred response to most human difficulty, and which Elena eventually came to recognize as its own form of grace. "I snapped at you twice before breakfast," she told him, one morning in November, when the guilt of it had built to a point she couldn't comfortably carry. "Yes," Augusto said. "I'm sorry." "I know." He poured her coffee. "You're fighting something that takes more patience than you have. That happens. That's not an excuse." "No," he agreed, "but it's a reason. Reasons and excuses are different." He set the coffee in front of her. Don't let the fighting make you someone you don't want to be, that's all. She looked at him. Have I already? Not yet, he said. So don't. She carried that with her into the months that followed, and it helped more than she told him. The breakthrough in the federal case came in the winter. A Graves syndicate attorney in the eastern capital, faced with the weight of documented evidence and the imminent prospect of being personally named in a federal fraud filing, chose self-preservation over loyalty and provided a sworn statement that named the organization's senior leadership and documented 15 years of coordinated land coercion across the territory. His name was Gideon Pruitt, and Elena would never quite forgive him for waiting as long as he had, because the ranches destroyed while he'd kept quiet were not abstract to her, but she accepted the information he provided because refusing it would have been the kind of principled gesture that felt good and accomplished nothing. Garrett Pell was formally charged in March, 16 months after he'd ridden through Iron Hollow's gate on a gray horse, and found the situation considerably different from what he'd planned for. The charges were broad, and the evidence was strong, and the trial, when it happened 6 months after that, produced the kind of verdict that changed things not just for the immediate parties, but for the territory's understanding of what could and couldn't be done to working ranchers by organized money. Elena sat in the courtroom gallery for the verdict. She sat straight-backed and quiet, dressed in the good clothes she'd bought in Caldwell the previous year and had worn exactly twice. Rhett sat beside her. Cade Gallagher was 2 rows back. Margaret Hale was in the front row on the opposite side, which was where she'd fought to be for 15 years. And the expression on her face when the verdict came through was the expression of a person receiving something they'd earned so hard and over so long that satisfaction had been replaced by something closer to completion. Elena didn't cry. She hadn't cried through most of it, which people who heard the story later sometimes found hard to believe. What she did was sit very still for a moment after the verdict, and then she put her hand over Rhett's on the courtroom bench, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear it, "Dad, they said your name." He turned his hand over and held hers, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have been better than silence. The territorial authorities formally cleared Elena's name in the same session. She'd been named in a fraudulent complaint filed by the syndicate 14 months earlier, a piece of bureaucratic spite that had added another thread to the already crowded legal tangle. The clearance came through as a single line in a court document, almost an afterthought, and she looked at it for a long time when Hale showed it to her. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," Hale said. "Legally, you never had a blemish. The record will reflect that." Elena folded the document and put it in her coat pocket. "My father never had his name cleared." "No," Hale said. She said it without softening it. "But the federal filing names him as a victim of a documented criminal organization. His name is in a record that isn't going away." She paused. "That's not enough. I know it isn't enough. But it's more than nothing." "It's more than nothing," Elena agreed. She looked at the courtroom, which was emptying around them. He'd have found something to complain about in how they phrased it. Hale almost smiled. "All the best ranchers do." They drove back to Iron Hollow that evening. Rhett drove, and Elena sat beside him, and the road was familiar in the way only roads you've traveled in every kind of weather and light and mood can be familiar. Not scenic, not dramatic, just known. The ridge appeared ahead of them the way it always did at this stretch of road, and Elena looked at it the way she'd been looking at it for over a year now, which was with the eyes of someone who understood that belonging to a place didn't mean the place was easy or beautiful or uncomplicated. It just meant the place was yours. "Hale said she might retire," Elena said, somewhere past the Langley turnoff. "She's been saying that for 10 years, Rhett said. "She told me she's serious this time." "She'll retire when the territory runs out of things to be wrong about," he said. "So probably not in our lifetimes." Elena smiled. A real one, not the almost kind. They came up to the ridge and the house was lit. Augusto had been alone all day and had apparently decided to make use of the time by cooking something that smelled like it was taking the question of supper seriously. The horses went into their stalls with the patience of animals who'd made this particular journey enough times to have opinions about the time it took. Rhett came back from the barn to find Elena standing on the porch, not going inside yet, looking out at the ridge in the last light. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She shook her head. "Just looking." He stood beside her. They looked at the same ridge. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "When this is really over, When the legal piece is finished and the federal case is closed and it's just, he paused, just the ranch. She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for a while, she realized. Not the fighting, not the defense of the thing, but what came after the defending, which was a question she hadn't let herself ask while the answer was still uncertain. I want to expand the herd, she said. The south pasture is underused. Langley said there's a water agreement we could reach that would make it viable. She paused. And I want to fix the east fence properly. Not patch it, redo it. The east fence is fine. The east fence is functional, she said. That's not the same thing. I want it done right. He looked at her. And? She knew what he was asking. She'd known he'd eventually ask. Not about the ranch logistics, but about the longer shape of things. She'd been carrying her own answer to it for a while without finding the right moment. And I want to register the land in both our names, she said, formally, at the land office. She looked at him. If that's what you want. You know what I want, he said. I know what I think you want. I'm asking you to say it. He looked at the ridge, then he looked at her. He was not good at saying things directly. She knew this, had known it since winter, had mostly made her peace with it because everything else about him was consistent in ways that mattered more than eloquence. Yes, he said, both names, formally. And anything else that goes with that, Elena. All of it. She nodded. Her throat moved. You could have said that more romantically, she said. I know. He looked at the ridge again. I'll try to do better next time. See that you do, she said, and went inside, and he stood on the porch for another minute listening to the sounds of the house. Augusto's kitchen work, Elena's voice saying something he couldn't quite hear, the horses settling for the night. And then he went in too. Mara Quinn arrived 3 years later. She came the way most things that changed. Iron Hollow came, without announcement, through the practical necessities of the frontier rather than through any deliberate plan. She was 16 and she'd been doing seasonal work across 4 ranches for the past 2 years in the particular way that young people without family or options made their way across the territory. Moving before anyone could ask too many questions, working hard enough to be kept but not hard enough to be indispensable, which was the strategy of someone who'd learned that being indispensable made leaving harder. Cade Gallagher's mother, Ruth, found her sleeping in her barn and sent her to Iron Hollow. Because, as Ruth put it, that girl needs someone to stay still long enough to notice her, which was not the most flattering possible description but was accurate. Elena noticed her. Not immediately in the way of a planned thing, she noticed her the way you notice a bird with an unusual flight pattern, with the particular attention of someone who'd learned that things moving differently than expected were worth watching. Mara worked fast and well, and with the focused intensity of someone for whom work was armor, which Elena recognized in the way you recognize your own old habits in someone younger. She was 16 and she had the eyes of someone who'd seen more than 16 warranted and had learned to keep that information from her face. Where are you from? Elena asked her, 2 weeks in. East, Mara said. East is a direction, not an answer. Mara looked at her with the assessing look that young people use when they're deciding how much honesty a situation will tolerate. Nowhere that's still there, she said. Elena recognized that answer in her bones. You can have the back room, she said. It's warm. I'm not asking for charity. I know you're not. I'm not offering charity. Elena looked at her. I'm offering the back room. It's got a window that faces the ridge, which is worth something in the morning. Mara stayed. She stayed with the particular wariness of someone who kept waiting for the terms to appear, and the terms didn't appear. And after about 6 months of waiting for them, she stopped waiting and started staying in the way that meant something. She was not easy. She had tempers and silences and a stubbornness that would have been irritating in someone without her reasons and was merely challenging in someone with them. She broke 2 fence posts in a single afternoon once and refused to explain how, and Elena decided the explanation mattered less than the repair, and made her fix them without making it into a lesson, which turned out to be the right call. She was exceptional with horses, better than anyone at Iron Hollow, including Elena, which Elena acknowledged without difficulty, because she'd been raised by a woman who saw other people's competence as information rather than competition. Rhett was quieter with her. Not cold, he didn't do cold, but careful in the way he was careful with anything that had been mishandled before arriving on his land. He let her set the pace. He worked alongside her without demanding conversation. He corrected her work when it needed correcting and complimented it when it warranted it, and he didn't editorialize beyond what the task required. One evening, about a year in, Mara came and sat on the porch while he was drinking his end-of-day coffee. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Rhett." She was quiet for a moment. "Elena told me about the syndicate, about what happened here." "She did?" "She said I should know the history of the land I'm working." Mara looked at the ridge. "She said the land remembers what was done for it." She paused. "She talks like that sometimes." "I know," he said. "Did it feel worth it, after?" He thought about the honest answer. "The feeling changes," he said. "When it was happening, worth it didn't enter into it. It was just, this is the thing in front of you, so you do it." He drank his coffee. "Afterward, worth it isn't quite the word either. It's more like, you understand the shape of what you did differently. You see what it made possible that wouldn't have been possible otherwise." He looked at her. "This conversation, for example." Mara looked at him. "That's either very wise or you're avoiding the question." "Probably both," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to it in a year, and he counted it as progress. The years moved in the way that years do when they're full enough to feel fast and hard enough to feel slow simultaneously. The legal piece closed completely. The final Graves Syndicate case was resolved by federal court 5 years after the night of the siege, with prison sentences for the organization's senior leadership, including the figures who'd given Pell his orders. The East Territory ranches that had been taken began working through a complicated and imperfect process of restitution that helped some of the displaced families and failed others in ways that the legal system seemed constitutionally unable to acknowledge as failure. Elena followed it all. She read every filing and every verdict and every piece of territory news connected to it, and her feelings about it remained complicated in ways she didn't try to simplify. Justice, she'd learned, was not a clean thing. It was lumpy and inconsistent and arrived late for most parties, and not at all for some. And making peace with that required setting down the idea that justice would eventually account for everything, and picking up instead the more manageable idea that what you did with the time you had was its own kind of answer. She and Rhett married in the second year, quietly, in Caldwell, with Augusto and Cade Gallagher as witnesses and Ruth Gallagher in attendance because Ruth went where she chose and hadn't asked whether she was invited. The ceremony was brief, and they rode home directly after, and the ranch was the same when they got back as it had been when they left, which was exactly right. Rhett developed a bad hip in his late 50s that he refused to discuss with any seriousness, and managed by adjusting how he moved rather than how much he worked, which drove Elena to a specific and recurring frustration. He would not see the doctor in Caldwell about it, a newer doctor now, the original having retired, until Elena arranged the appointment without telling him and simply informed him when it was, in a tone that closed the subject before he could open it. "You're managing me," he said. "I'm making decisions about things you won't decide for yourself," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Ask me in 20 years when you still have use of that hip." He went to the appointment. Augusto left Iron Hollow when he was 62, not in any dramatic way, just the natural conclusion of a man who had done what he came to do and had somewhere he'd been meaning to return to for years. He had a sister in the South and land she'd been holding for him in the informal way of family who know you'll eventually come back. He left on a Thursday morning, which was an ordinary day, and shook Rhett's hand and looked at Elena for a moment and said, "The East Fence." You were right about the East Fence, which was his way of saying everything he wasn't going to say, and she understood it perfectly. They hired other hands over the years. Most were good. One was not, and that situation resolved itself without requiring anything dramatic. The herd grew, as Elena had wanted, and the south pasture came into proper use, and the water agreement with Langley's operation, Tom Langley had by then passed the ranch to his daughter, who had her father's stubborn practicality and had expanded the operation considerably, proved as valuable as she'd predicted. Marquin stopped being someone who worked the ranch and became someone who ran parts of it, which happened so gradually that there was no single moment when it changed. She was 23 when Elena first left her in charge of a cattle drive to the eastern market, and she came back with better prices than Elena had gotten the previous year, and a sheaf of notes about the road conditions that she'd written down during the drive with the instinct of someone who'd absorbed, without being taught it directly, the value of documentation. She was not an easy person at 23 any more than she'd been at 16. She was sharp-tongued and occasionally arrogant about the things she did well, and sometimes too hard on the people who worked under her when they made the kind of mistakes that experience eventually corrects without punishment. Elena told her so, once, directly. "You remind me of someone," Elena said. "Who?" "Me, at your age, when I was doing the same thing." Elena looked at her. "Being right isn't the same as being good at bringing people with you. I learned that the hard way. I'm offering you the shorter path." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Did someone tell you?" "Eventually," Elena said, "later than was useful." Mara absorbed this. She was better at it the following year, though she'd never be entirely patient, and Elena decided that entirely patient was probably not the goal anyway. The edge in her was part of what made her effective, and rounding it down to nothing would have been its own kind of waste. Rhett died in the spring, 2 months after his 71st birthday, in the house he'd lived in for 40 years, and defended and rebuilt and shared with a woman he hadn't expected and been given more by than he'd known how to acknowledge. It was a quiet death, a heart that had worked hard for a long time and had made its own decision about when the work was done. He was in his bed, which was where he'd wanted to be, in the room where the window faced the ridge, and the ridge that morning had the clear, hard light of early spring, still cold, with the promise of something warmer not quite here yet. Elena sat with him for a long time after. She wasn't going to describe it to anyone, and no one asked her to, and that was the right call. What she'd say later to people who knew how to listen for the real answer was that she'd learned from him what loyalty actually cost and what it actually built, and that the two things were not as different as she'd assumed when she'd arrived at Black Hollow Station with frozen hands and nothing else. She didn't fall apart after. This was not because she wasn't broken by it. She was, in the specific way that losing the person who'd seen you build yourself from broken material breaks you differently than anything else can. But because falling apart was a choice she didn't have the temperament for, and because the ridge was there in the morning the same as it had always been, and the work was there, and Mara was there, and the shape of what she was supposed to do was still clear, even when everything else was blurred. She passed the primary management of Iron Hollow to Mara over the following 2 years, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the measured way of someone who understood that handoffs done wrong destroy what they're meant to preserve. She stayed. She didn't go anywhere, Bo. This was her land. Her name was on the deed alongside Rhett's, and now alone on the revised deed, and she had no intention of leaving it. But she moved differently through it. More garden than cattle. More walking the fence lines in the morning for the pleasure of the walking than for the assessment of the condition. She planted things. This surprised her more than anyone else. She'd never been particularly interested in gardens, had always preferred the larger work of the ranch to the small, patient work of growing. But she found herself in her late 60s with her hands in the dirt of the south side of the house, putting in the kinds of things that took years to mature, which was a specific kind of faith she hadn't known she was capable of. Mara watched her do this one afternoon and said, "You're planting apple trees." "Yes," Elena said. "They won't produce for 6 years." "I know. You're planning to be here in 6 years." "I'm planning to make sure the next person who's here has apple trees," Elena said. She patted the dirt around the roots. "It's not the same thing." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll be here." "I know," Elena said. "That's why I'm planting them." The people of Caldwell and the surrounding territory had developed, over the years, a relationship with Elena Mercer. She'd taken Rhett's name and kept her own beside it, which was not common practice but which she'd done without asking anyone's opinion. That was complicated in the particular way that relationships with people who've made themselves into something you didn't expect tend to be complicated. She was respected, which was different from being liked, though some people managed both. She was known, which in a territory where anonymity had been used against people she loved, was not something she took lightly. She was consulted, occasionally, by people with land disputes or complicated situations, not because she'd set herself up as an authority, but because she'd been through enough that the pattern recognition she'd developed had value. She didn't love this role. She did it anyway, because not doing it because it was uncomfortable was the kind of reasoning she'd talked herself out of a long time ago. When she died, she was 81 years old, in the same house, in the same room, with the window facing the ridge. The spring light was doing what spring light did at that altitude. Thin, and sharp and honest. Mara was there, and Mara's daughter, who was 8 years old and had opinions about horses that were going to cause everyone in the vicinity considerable happiness and trouble in roughly equal measure for the next decade. The girl's name was Clara, which had been Mara's idea, and which Elena had received with the silence of someone who understood that some things were too large for an immediate response. There was a gathering in Caldwell, afterward, which was attended by people from across the territory. Some who'd known Elena personally, some who'd only known the shape of what she'd done. They came because the territory had a memory, and the memory had her in it, and some part of them understood, even without being able to articulate it precisely, that what had happened at Iron Hollow Ridge 30 years earlier had changed something about what was possible in the places they lived and worked. That the water rights held. That the land stayed in the hands of the people who'd worked it. That the Graves Syndicate's model of organized acquisition had been broken not by any single heroic moment, but by the patient, grinding, imperfect work of people who refused to be separated from each other when separation was exactly what the people coming for them needed. Mara stood at the gathering and said what she had to say, which was not long because she'd inherited Rhett's economy of speech along with his house. She said that Elena Voss Mercer had taught her that the difference between surviving and building was intention, that surviving happened to you, and building was the choice you made with the survival once you had it. She said that Iron Hollow Ridge was the proof of that, standing at the edge of the territory where it had always stood, with its east fence properly done, and its apple trees in the 3rd year of production, and its water rights intact, and its name on a deed that no one was going to take. She said that the woman who'd arrived at Black Hollow Station with frozen hands and nothing else had left behind a thing that mattered, and that was the only kind of ending worth working toward. The ridge was there when the gathering ended. It was there in the morning when Mara's daughter went out to see the horses, and it was there in the evening when the light hit it at the angle that made it look almost like something you'd paint. It held the creek and the fence lines and the grave markers on the south slope. Rhett's, and beside it, eventually, Elena's. And it held the particular kind of quiet that comes to places where hard things have been done and not forgotten. Iron Hollow endured, not because it had been defended perfectly, because it hadn't. The defense had been costly and messy, and had left marks on everyone who'd been part of it. Not because justice had been complete, because it hadn't been complete, and Elena had known that and lived with it, and stopped waiting for completeness to be the measure. It endured because people had looked at what was being asked of them, the running, the silence, the surrendering of what was theirs, and had chosen, separately and then together, something harder and more worthwhile. It endured because a woman who had every reason to keep running had gotten off a wagon on a cold morning and looked at a ridge and decided that this, here, was where the running stopped. And in the end, that decision, not the battles, not the verdicts, not the documents filed in territory offices, that was the thing that made Iron Hollow what it became. That was the whole of it.